They said a woman could be worth less than a bad horse out here. But that day, the silence proved them wrong. The rope cut into her wrists, not deep, but enough to remind her she no longer belonged to herself. And Ayanna stood in the center of the dusty street, shoulders straight, chin lifted just enough to deny them the satisfaction they came for. The sun hung high, unforgiving, casting sharp shadows across the wooden storefronts, where men leaned with arms crossed and women watched from behind half-closed shutters, all of them pretending this was just another deal, just another day in a town where debts were settled in ways no law ever wrote down. The man beside her smelled of whiskey and leather worn too long in the heat, his fingers gripping the rope like it was already part of his life, like she was, and when he laughed, it carried easy across the street, careless, practiced, the kind of laugh that came from never being told no. Fair trade. Someone muttered from the crowd, and a few heads nodded, because fairness here didn't mean right. It meant accepted. Ayanna didn't look at them, didn't give them the small mercy of seeing fear, because fear was something they understood, something they could use, and she had already decided they would take nothing more from her than what they could hold in their hands. A small breeze moved through the street, lifting dust in thin spirals that caught the light, and for a moment it felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to shift, something no one could quite name. Caleb Thorne stood at the far edge of it all, half in shadow beneath the overhang of the saloon, one boot resting against the post, hat low, watching without moving. The way a man watches when he knows stepping forward changes more than just a moment. He had seen trades before, had passed through towns that ran on the same quiet agreements. But there was something in the way this one held itself together, too tight, too still, like a storm waiting just beyond the hills. Ayanna's eyes flickered once, not searching, not pleading, just measuring, and for the briefest second they met his. And something passed there, not recognition, not yet, but the awareness of another person who wasn't looking at her like property. The man tugged the rope lightly, impatient now, as if eager to be done with the spectacle, and Ayanna's feet shifted in the dirt, not resisting, not yielding, just finding balance, the kind of balance that comes from knowing when the ground might give way beneath you. "You hear that?" the man said, louder this time, turning slightly so the crowd could catch his words. "Bought myself a quiet one." And a few chuckles answered him, thin and hollow, like even they didn't fully believe what they were part of. Caleb's jaw tightened, almost invisible beneath the shadow of his hat, and he pushed off the post, slow, deliberate, each step measured across the wooden boards and down into the street where the dust met his boots and clung there. No one stopped him, but they noticed, conversations fading into murmurs, eyes shifting, because there was a difference between watching and stepping in, and everyone knew it. Ayanna saw him coming before he spoke, saw the way he carried himself without hurry, without the need to prove anything to anyone, and something in her stance changed, subtle as a breath, like a line drawn where there hadn't been one before. The man followed her gaze, annoyance flickering across his face as he sized up the stranger approaching, already ready to dismiss him, because men like him always believed they held the last word. Caleb stopped a few feet away, close enough to be heard without raising his voice, far enough to leave space. And for a moment he said nothing at all, just let the quiet stretch, let the weight of it settle over the street until even the breeze seemed to pause. Then he spoke, calm, even, the kind of tone that didn't ask permission and didn't offer explanation. How much was the debt? And the question landed differently than anyone expected, not a challenge, not an insult, just a simple truth laid bare in front of them all. The man blinked, thrown off for a fraction of a second, before recovering with a smirk. "Enough," he said, tightening his grip on the rope. "And it's paid." And the crowd shifted again, sensing something turning beneath the surface. Something they couldn't quite follow yet. Caleb nodded once, like he had heard what he needed, and his hand moved slowly to his pocket, not rushed, not dramatic, just a quiet motion that somehow pulled every eye toward it. Coins glinted as they caught the sunlight, bright against the dust, and for a second no one spoke, because no one knew what came next, not really. Ayanna's gaze dropped to the ground where the light danced across metal, then lifted again, not to the coins, but to Caleb, searching now, not for help, but for intent, for the thing that separates one kind of man from another. The rope between her wrists hung still, unmoving, but something in the air had already begun to shift, slow and steady, like the first sign of wind before a storm, and though no one said it out loud, everyone felt it. The moment had changed, and whatever came next would not follow the rules they thought they understood. The coins did not hit the ground all at once. They fell in a slow, measured rhythm, one after another, each small ring against the dirt carrying farther than it should have, until the street itself seemed to listen. Caleb Thorne did not look at the man, not yet. His eyes stayed on the space between them, on the rope, on the quiet defiance in the woman's posture that had not cracked even for a second. The man let out a short laugh, sharper this time, uncertain at the edges, like a man who suddenly realized the ground beneath him might not be as solid as he thought. "You buying something, stranger?" he asked, voice louder now. Reaching for control, he felt slipping. Caleb shook his head once, simple, almost dismissive, and that answer confused more than any challenge could have. "No," he said, calm as before. "I am settling a number." And the distinction hung there, strange and unfamiliar to everyone listening. The crowd shifted again, boots scraping lightly against packed earth, shoulders turning as men glanced at each other without speaking. Because this was not how things were done. Not here, not in a place where everything had a clear owner once money changed hands. Ayanna watched him closely now, not with hope, not yet, but with a kind of careful attention. Like someone reading a language she had not heard in a long time, but still recognized somewhere deep inside. The rope between her wrists moved slightly as the man tightened his grip again, a reflex more than a decision, as if holding tighter might keep the moment from changing shape. "Debt is paid," he said again, slower this time, as if repeating it could make it more true. "She is mine now." And there it was, the word that settled over the street heavier than the dust. Mine, a word everyone understood too well. Caleb finally lifted his gaze, meeting the man's eyes without urgency, without anger, and that lack of heat made something colder settle into the space between them. "Then you will not mind if the debt is paid twice," Caleb replied, and he nudged the small pile of coins forward with the toe of his boot, not as an offer, not as a negotiation, just as a fact placed in front of them. The man's expression shifted, calculation replacing confidence as he looked down at the money. Then back up again, measuring, weighing, trying to find the angle that kept him in control. "And what do you get?" he asked, narrowing his eyes, because every man in that town knew nothing came without a claim attached. Caleb did not answer right away, and in that pause the wind picked up again, carrying the dry scent of the plains through the street, brushing past Ayanna's face, lifting a loose strand of her dark hair across her cheek. She did not move to push it away. "Nothing," Caleb said. Finally, and the word landed heavier than any demand could have, because it made no sense in a place built on taking. A murmur rippled through the onlookers, low and uneasy, the kind that comes when something breaks the rules everyone depends on. The man frowned, clearly dissatisfied with an answer that offered no angle, no leverage, and for a moment he looked almost smaller, like the certainty he wore had slipped just enough to show the doubt beneath. "That is not how this works," he muttered. But it sounded less like a statement and more like a question he did not want answered. Caleb did not argue, did not raise his voice. He simply stepped closer, closing the distance by a single pace, enough to make the space between them feel intentional. "It does today," he said quietly. Ayanna's breath shifted, barely noticeable, but it was there, a subtle change in the rhythm of someone who had been holding still for too long. Her eyes moved once more between the man and the stranger, searching for the catch, for the hidden hook that always followed words like these. There was always a cost, always a condition, always a moment when the favor turned into another kind of chain. The rope at her wrists seemed heavier now, not because it had changed, but because the possibility of it being removed had entered the space, and that made every fiber of it more real. The man hesitated, and that hesitation was enough for everyone to see, enough for the balance of the moment to tilt just slightly. He looked at the coins again, then at the faces around him, searching for support, for someone to laugh, to back him up, to restore the order he understood. But the laughter did not come this time. Only silence, thick and waiting. Finally, with a sharp exhale, he bent down and scooped up the money. Quick, almost defensive, like a man grabbing something before it could be taken back. "Fine," he said, straightening, forcing a grin that did not reach his eyes. "Your loss." And with a rough motion he pushed the rope forward, releasing it from his grip. It fell slack between Ayana's wrists, no longer anchored to another hand, just hanging there, meaningless without someone holding the other. And, for a second, no one moved. Caleb did not step forward, did not reach out, did not claim what had just been given up. He simply stood there, watching. Ayana felt the absence first, the sudden lightness where tension had been, and it confused her more than the rope itself ever had. Slowly, she lowered her hands, testing the space, testing the truth of what had just happened. Her fingers brushed against the rough fibers, then paused. The crowd leaned in without realizing it, drawn by something quiet and fragile unfolding in front of them. Caleb reached into his pocket once more, but this time he pulled out something small, worn, and familiar, a simple necklace with a stone that caught the light. In a way that felt older than the town itself. He held it out, not stepping closer, just offering it across the space between them. Ayana's eyes fixed on it, and something inside her shifted, deeper than fear, deeper than anger, something that remembered who she had been before this street, before this moment, before anyone thought they could measure her worth in coins. "This belongs to you," Caleb said, his voice steady. And for the first time, there was something in it that felt like understanding rather than decision. The rope still hung from her wrists, but no one was holding it anymore. And the difference between those two things was something the entire town could feel, but not yet explain. For a long moment, she did not take the necklace, and that hesitation carried more weight than anything spoken so far, because out here nothing was ever given without a reason, and nothing ever came back without a cost. Ayana's eyes stayed on the small stone resting in Caleb's open palm, the way it caught the sunlight, the way it seemed untouched by the dust and noise around them, as if it belonged to a different world entirely, one that did not measure people in debts and bargains. The rope still hung loose around her wrists, its fibers brushing against her skin with every slight movement, a reminder of what had just been taken from her and what had not yet been fully returned. The town watched, every man and woman holding still, not out of respect, but out of uncertainty, because they did not know what this moment meant or how it would end. Caleb did not move closer, did not insist. His arm remained extended but relaxed, as if he understood that whatever happened next could not be forced, not even gently. "Take it," someone whispered from the edge of the crowd, but the voice sounded wrong, out of place, like a suggestion that did not belong to the moment. Ayana ignored it, her attention never leaving Caleb, searching his face for something familiar, something predictable, something she could name and place into the patterns she understood. But there was nothing there that fit, no hunger, no claim, no quiet expectation of return, and that absence unsettled her more than anything else could have. Slowly, almost cautiously, she raised her hands, the rope sliding slightly down her wrists as her fingers moved forward, and when her skin finally brushed against the necklace, there was a pause, a breath held between two worlds. She took it, but she did not lower her hands right away, did not step back, did not break the space between them. Instead, she looked at it for a second, then closed her fingers around it, firm, deliberate, as if reclaiming something that had never truly left her. The crowd shifted again, the quiet growing heavier, because they had expected something else, expected her to run, to show relief, to collapse into the kind of gratitude they understood, but she did none of those things. She stood exactly where she had been, only now with the necklace in her hand and the rope hanging loose, and that stillness made the moment feel unfinished. Caleb lowered his arm, not in disappointment, not in relief, just in acceptance, like a man who rolls between what had been and what might come next. Ayana's fingers moved to the rope, feeling its rough texture, the simple knot that held it together, and she paused again, not because she could not undo it, but because doing so meant accepting what had just happened, meant stepping into something unknown without the weight she had carried for so long. The town leaned in without realizing it, drawn to that small motion, because it was not the paying of the debt that mattered now, it was what came after, what a person did when no one was holding them anymore. Caleb did not speak again, did not offer help, his stillness now a kind of respect, a refusal to take even this final step from her. Ayanna drew a slow breath, steady, controlled, and then her fingers began to work the knot, careful, precise, the way someone does when they have learned to rely only on themselves. It did not take long. The rope loosened, then slipped, then fell away entirely, landing softly in the dust at her feet. No one moved. No one spoke. The sound of it touching the ground seemed louder than it should have been. Ayanna looked down at it for a moment, then lifted her gaze again, not to the crowd, not to the man who had tried to claim her, but to the open space beyond them, the road stretching out past the edge of the town, wide and uncertain. She took one step forward, then another, slow at first, as if testing the truth of each movement. And with every step the distance between her and the place she had stood grew, not just in space, but in meaning. The crowd parted without being asked, creating a path they did not realize they were making, because something in the way she walked told them this was no longer theirs to control. Caleb remained where he was, watching her go, his expression unchanged, but his eyes following every step until she reached the edge of the street. Ayanna did not look back immediately, not out of pride, not out of fear, but because she needed to feel the weight of her own choice settle fully before she acknowledged anything behind her. When she finally did turn, just slightly, her gaze found Caleb once more, and in that brief exchange there was no debt, no claim, no expectation, only a quiet understanding that something had shifted in both of them in ways neither could yet fully name. Then she faced forward again and continued walking, the necklace held firmly in her hand, the dust rising around her steps, carrying her away from a place that had tried to define her and into something that had not yet decided what she would become. The sound of her footsteps faded slower than it should have, each one pressing into the dirt like it carried more than just her weight, like it carried the echo of everything that had just happened, and the town did not return to its noise, not yet, because something had been left behind that none of them could name. Caleb Thorne remained still for a moment longer, his eyes following the line where the road met the horizon, watching the dust settle in thin, uneven trails where Ayanna had walked. And only when she disappeared beyond the last stretch of wooden fencing did he finally shift, a quiet exhale leaving him as if he had been holding it longer than he realized. Behind him, voices began to return, low at first, uncertain, then growing as men tried to explain what they had seen in ways that made sense to them. "Fool gave away good money," one muttered, shaking his head, while another replied, "He bought nothing." And that word nothing carried more confusion than judgment. Caleb did not turn toward them, did not offer a defense or a reason, because there was nothing he could say that would fit into the way they understood the world. Instead, he stepped back toward the shade of the saloon, his boots heavy against the wooden boards, each step measured, unhurried, like a man returning to something familiar even though he knew it would not feel the same anymore. The rope still lay in the street where it had fallen, half buried in dust now, its loose ends curled slightly by the wind, and for a moment no one moved to pick it up, as if touching it might bring the moment back, might force them to confront what it had meant. Across the street, a woman who had watched from her doorway slowly stepped forward, her eyes fixed on that piece of rope, and after a brief hesitation, she bent down and lifted it, not with ownership, but with something closer to curiosity, as if she were holding a question she could not yet answer. The man who had taken the money earlier stood off to the side now, his posture stiff, his confidence worn thin, and he avoided looking at anyone directly, as though the eyes of the town had turned from approval to something else, something quieter and more uncomfortable. He turned away first, muttering under his breath, disappearing into the narrow space between buildings where the sun did not quite reach, leaving behind the echo of a claim that no longer held. Caleb rested his hand lightly against the saloon post again, the same place he had stood before, but the stillness felt different now, heavier, like the air itself had shifted around him. He reached into his pocket out of habit, fingers brushing against the absence of the necklace he had carried for so long, and for a brief second his hand paused there, not in regret, not in doubt, but in recognition that something he had held onto had finally found its way back where it belonged. The breeze moved again, stronger this time. carrying the scent of dry grass and distant hills, and with it came the faintest trace of something else, something almost forgotten, like memory riding on the wind. Beyond the edge of town, Ayana walked without stopping, her steps steady now, more certain with each passing moment, the weight in her chest shifting from something tight and restrained into something unfamiliar but not unwelcome. The necklace rested in her hand, its edges warm from her skin, and every so often her fingers tightened around it, grounding her in the reality of what had happened, reminding her that this was not a dream, not a passing illusion that would fade when she turned back. The road stretched ahead, wide and open, the kind of distance that could swallow a person whole if they let it. But Ayana did not hesitate, because for the first time in a long while, the direction she chose belonged only to her. She passed the last marker of the town, a weathered post leaning slightly to one side, its faded paint barely visible under years of sun, and as she crossed that invisible line, something inside her shifted again, quieter this time, deeper, like a door closing behind her without a sound. She slowed then, just for a moment, not because she was unsure, but because the silence out here was different from the silence in town, less heavy, less watching, more open, like it allowed space for thought instead of pressing it down. Her eyes moved to the horizon, tracing the line of distant hills where the land rose gently against the sky, and for a brief second, she wondered if he was still watching, if the man who had stepped into her path and then stepped away again remained where she had left him. She did not turn to check, not yet, because some things were better left unconfirmed, better held in the quiet space between knowing and not knowing. Back in town, Caleb finally pushed himself away from the post, the murmur of voices rising and falling behind him, and he stepped out into the street once more, his gaze dropping briefly to the spot where the rope had been, now empty, as if even that small reminder had chosen to move on. He adjusted the brim of his hat, a simple motion, familiar, and began to walk in the opposite direction from where Ayana had gone, not following, not chasing, just moving forward along his own path. The town resumed its rhythm slowly, reluctantly, like a machine starting up after being stopped too long, but something in it had changed, something small and quiet that would linger long after the dust settled. And somewhere between the fading sound of footsteps on two different roads, a truth settled into the space they had both left behind, not spoken, not explained, but felt all the same, that freedom, once given, does not echo with noise, it settles in silence, and it stays. By late afternoon, the town had already begun to tell the story wrong, reshaping it into something easier to hold, something that did not challenge the way things had always worked, but the truth lingered in the quiet spaces between words, in the way people avoided certain glances and certain questions. Caleb Thorne walked along the outer edge of the settlement where the buildings gave way to open land, his boots pressing into the softer dirt beyond the packed street. Each step slower now, less certain, as if the rhythm he had known no longer fit quite the same. He did not look back, not toward the saloon, not toward the place where the rope had fallen, because he knew what he would see there, a town already moving on, already forgetting the shape of what had almost changed it. Instead, he kept his eyes on the horizon, where the light had begun to soften, turning the wide sky into long bands of gold and pale blue, the kind of light that made everything feel both distant and close at the same time. Somewhere ahead, beyond the low rise of the land, Ayana had slowed her pace, not from exhaustion, but from the unfamiliar weight of choice, because walking away was one thing, but deciding where to go next was something else entirely. The wind moved gently across the grass now, quieter than before, carrying with it the faint scent of sage and dry earth, and she let it settle around her, grounding her in the present, in the reality of her steps, in the simple truth that no one stood behind her anymore. She stopped near a small bend in the trail where the land dipped slightly, offering a brief view back toward the town, its shape distant now, softened by light and dust, and for the first time since she had left, she turned fully to look at it. From here, it seemed smaller, less certain, as if the place that had tried to define her could not quite hold its shape without her standing in it. Her fingers tightened around the necklace again, the smooth stone pressing into her palm, and she lifted it slowly, bringing it closer to her face, studying it in the fading light as though seeing it for the first time. The marks along its edge, worn by years of use, spoke of something older than the moment she had just walked through, something that belonged to a time before debts and bargains had tangled her path. She closed her eyes briefly, not in sorrow, not in relief, but in recognition, letting the quiet settle fully into her chest. Behind her, far enough to remain unseen, but close enough to feel the same shift in the air, Caleb reached the edge of the same rise from a different path, his steps slowing as he caught sight of the distant figure standing still against the horizon. He did not call out, did not move closer, because there was a line between them now that had not existed before, a line drawn not by distance but by choice. He stood there for a moment, the wind brushing past him, carrying the faint outline of her presence, and he wondered, not for the first time, what a person did after they walked away from everything that had tried to claim them. Ayanna lowered the necklace, her gaze lifting again to the open land ahead, and this time when she turned forward, there was no hesitation in it, no second glance back, because whatever answer she had been searching for did not lie behind her anymore. She took a step, then another, her pace steady, her posture unchanged, but something in the way she moved now held a quiet certainty that had not been there before. Caleb watched until the distance between them grew too wide to hold clearly, until her figure became part of the landscape itself, no longer separate, no longer defined by what had happened in that town, and only then did he shift his weight and turn away, not following, not turning back, simply choosing his own direction in the same silent way he had before. The sun dipped lower, stretching shadows long across the ground, connecting paths that would never cross again in quite the same way. And the land held both of them without judgment, without memory of what had passed. Only the quiet acknowledgement that something had changed, and though no words were spoken, though no promises were made, the space they had left behind carried a truth that would not fade easily, that sometimes the greatest act a person can offer is not to take, not to claim, but to step back and leave another soul standing on their own feet, even if it means never knowing where that path might lead. Night came slower out on the open land, stretching itself across the horizon in long, quiet shadows, and Ayanna felt the shift before she saw it. The way the air cooled just enough to carry sound farther, the way the wind softened into something that whispered instead of pushed. She had walked 4 miles now, though distance no longer felt like something to measure, only something to move through, and when she finally stopped again, it was not because she had to, but because she chose to. The ground beneath her feet dipped into a shallow valley where a narrow stream traced its way through the earth, its surface catching the last light of the sun like a thin ribbon of silver, and she stepped toward it, slow, deliberate, as if entering a place that did not belong to the past she had left behind. Kneeling beside the water, she let her fingers brush against its surface, feeling the cold clarity of it, the way it moved without hesitation, without memory, and for a moment she simply watched the ripples spread outward, small and quiet, disappearing into something larger. The necklace rested in her other hand, and she opened her fingers slightly, letting the stone catch the fading light once more, its surface reflecting something steadier now, something that did not waver with her breath. She lowered it carefully, dipping it into the water, not to clean it, not to change it, but to let it meet something untouched, something that existed outside the reach of the town and everything it had tried to place on her. The current moved gently around it, carrying away the dust, the traces of hands that had held it without understanding, and when she lifted it again, the stone seemed the same, yet different, as if it had remembered something she had nearly forgotten. Behind her, far beyond the valley, Caleb Thorne had made camp near a line of low hills where the grass grew thicker, his horse tied loosely to a post he had driven into the ground, the animal grazing quietly in the fading light. He sat near a small fire, its glow steady but contained, the kind of fire built for warmth rather than attention, and he watched the flames for a long time without really seeing them, his thoughts moving along paths that did not settle easily. He had walked away before, from places, from people, from things that did not sit right in his chest, but this time felt different, not heavier, not lighter, just unresolved, like a question that had not been asked out loud. He reached for his canteen, taking a slow drink, the cool water grounding him in the present, and as he lowered it, His gaze drifted again toward the direction of the valley, though he could not see it from where he sat. Ayana arose from the edge of the stream, the water still clinging to her fingers, and for a moment she let them rest against the side of her dress, leaving faint marks that would dry and fade without a trace. Much like everything else she had carried from the town, she lifted the necklace again, this time bringing it toward her neck, hesitating only briefly before fastening it into place, the familiar weight settling against her skin in a way that felt both new and remembered. The sky above her deepened into shades of blue and violet, the first stars beginning to show through, distant and steady, and she looked up at them, her gaze tracing patterns she had known since before she understood their meaning, patterns that did not change no matter where she stood. She drew a slow breath, letting the night settle around her, and then she moved again, not back toward the town, not toward any place she had known before, but forward, deeper into the land that stretched wide and unclaimed. Caleb added another small piece of wood to the fire, the flame shifting slightly before settling again, and he leaned back, resting his hands on the ground behind him, his posture relaxed but his thoughts still moving. He had not expected anything in return, had not waited for it, and yet, something about the way she had looked at him before leaving remained, not as a burden, but as a quiet presence that refused to fade. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the night sounds around him, the soft movement of his horse, the distant call of something unseen, and the steady rhythm of the wind across the hills. Out in the valley, Ayana's steps grew more certain with each passing moment, her path guided not by roads or markers, but by something quieter, something that did not need to be spoken. The land opened before her, vast and indifferent, yet somehow welcoming in its own way, offering no promises, only space, and she accepted it without hesitation. The distance between her and the town grew with every step, but it no longer felt like escape, no longer felt like something she was running from. It felt like movement towards something she had yet to name, and somewhere between the fading light of the day and the quiet rise of the night, both of them carried forward the same unspoken truth, that what had passed between them was not an ending, not a beginning, but a moment that would follow them in ways neither could yet understand, shaping paths that had only just begun to unfold. The night did not rush, it settled slowly, pressing its quiet weight across the land, and Ayana walked beneath it without fear, her steps guided by something deeper than sight, something that had begun to return to her the moment the rope fell away. The stars stretched wide above her, steady and countless, and though the land ahead held no road, no sign, she moved as if she had always known the direction, as if the silence itself was speaking in a language she had almost forgotten. The necklace rested against her skin now, warm from her body, no longer just an object but a reminder, a quiet anchor tying her to something that could not be taken, and every time it shifted with her movement, she felt it, not as weight, but as presence, somewhere behind her, far enough to be unseen. Caleb Thorne stirred from his place near the dying fire, the embers casting a faint glow that barely reached beyond a few feet, and he stood slowly, brushing dust from his hands as he looked out into the darkness, his eyes adjusting to the dim outlines of the hills beyond. Sleep had not come easily, not because of danger, not because of worry, but because of something quieter, something that did not settle the way it should have. He moved toward his horse, resting a hand briefly against its neck, feeling the steady warmth of the animal, grounding himself in something simple and known. For a long moment, he stood there without moving, the wind brushing lightly against his coat, carrying the distant sound of the night. And then, without any clear reason, he turned his gaze back toward the valley he had passed earlier, the place where the land dipped and the air had felt different. Ayana had reached the far edge of that same valley now, her pace slowing again as the ground began to rise, the slope gentle but steady, and she paused at the base of it, her eyes lifting toward the ridge above, where the outline of the land met the sky in a clean, unbroken line. Something in her chest shifted, not warning, not fear, but awareness, the kind that comes when a path begins to change without asking. She listened, not with her ears alone, but with the quiet sense that had carried her this far. And for a moment there was nothing, only the wind, only the distant call of the night. Then, faint and far, the sound of movement reached her, Not loud, not hurried, just enough to be noticed. Enough to remind her that the land was never truly empty. She did not retreat, did not hide. She simply stood, her posture steady, her breathing even. Waiting, Caleb moved without urgency, but with purpose now, his steps carrying him along the ridge line where the ground remained firm and open, his eyes scanning the distance not for threat, but for understanding, for the shape of something he could not yet name. The fire behind him had dimmed completely, leaving only a faint trail of smoke rising into the night, and he did not look back at it, because whatever had drawn him forward was stronger than the comfort of staying. Ayanna reached the top of the rise and stopped, the land opening before her once more, wider than before, stretching into darkness that held no clear edges, and there, at a distance that made him little more than a shadow against the sky, she saw him. Caleb paused as well, his figure still against the horizon, not approaching, not retreating, simply present, and for a moment neither of them moved, the space between them filled only by the quiet of the night and the distance they had both chosen. It was not chance, not entirely, but it was not planned either, something in between, something that existed outside of reason. Ayanna's hand moved briefly to the necklace, her fingers brushing the stone as if confirming its place, and then she let it fall again, her gaze steady on the figure ahead. Caleb did not speak, did not raise a hand, he only stood there, allowing the moment to exist without forcing it into something more. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint scent of water and earth between them, a reminder of the path she had taken and the path he had followed, separate but somehow crossing again. Ayanna took a single step forward, then stopped, not as an invitation, not as a retreat, but as a choice, a small movement that carried more meaning than distance. Caleb watched, understanding without needing to define it, and he mirrored nothing. He did not move closer, did not close the gap, because whatever this moment was, it did not belong to action, it belonged to recognition. Time stretched, quiet and unbroken, and in that stillness, something settled between them, not a bond, not yet, but a shared understanding that neither owed the other anything, and yet neither had walked away unchanged. Finally, Ayanna turned slightly, her gaze shifting from him back to the land ahead, and without another pause, she continued forward, her path, her own, her steps steady and sure. Caleb remained where he was, watching her until the darkness took her outline completely, until she became part of the night itself, and only then did he draw a slow breath and turn away once more, the direction he chose different from before, but no less certain. The distance between them returned, wider now, but not empty, carrying with it the quiet truth that some meetings do not ask for closeness. They ask only to be seen, and once seen, they do not need to stay. The night stretched deeper after they parted, not darker, but fuller, as if the land itself had taken note of what had passed between them and decided to hold it quietly beneath the surface. Ayanna moved forward without looking back again, her steps carrying her across ground that felt different with every mile, less like something to endure and more like something to belong to. And though the path ahead remained uncertain, it no longer felt empty. The stars above shifted slowly, marking time, in a way that asked nothing from her, and she let their steady presence guide her, not as direction, but as reassurance that some things remained unchanged no matter where she walked. The necklace rested against her chest, its weight now familiar, and with each step it tapped lightly against her skin, a small, constant reminder that what had been taken once could return, not through force, but through something quieter, something harder to define. The land rose and fell in gentle waves beneath her feet, and as the night deepened, a faint glow began to gather along the distant horizon, the first sign of dawn waiting its turn. Far behind her, Caleb Thorne continued along his own path, his silhouette moving across the ridgeline where the wind held steady and the ground stretched wide and open. And though he had turned away from her, the direction he chose now felt less like leaving and more like continuing something that had already begun. His thoughts did not settle into words. They moved instead through memory and instinct, through the quiet recognition that not all moments demanded resolution, that some simply asked to be carried forward. The night air cooled further, brushing against his face, clearing the last traces of the day from his mind, and he adjusted his pace, neither faster nor slower, just steady, as if the rhythm itself mattered more than the destination. Somewhere between them, the land held the space where their paths had crossed, not marked, not remembered in any visible way, but changed all the same, like a place where the ground had shifted just enough to alter everything that came after. Ayana reached a higher stretch of ground just as the first light touched the sky, a thin line of pale gold breaking through the darkness, and she paused there, not from weariness, but from instinct, turning her face toward the rising day. The air felt different now, carrying the promise of warmth, of clarity, and she closed her eyes briefly, letting that shift settle into her, letting the past night become something behind her instead of something she carried. When she opened them again, the land before her had taken on new shape, the details clearer, the distance more defined, and for the first time she could see the outline of something ahead, faint but real, a cluster of trees marking water, or shelter, or simply a place to stop. She did not hesitate. She stepped toward it with the same steady certainty that had brought her this far, her path her own in a way it had never been before. Caleb saw the same light from his side of the hills, the horizon opening into day as the darkness pulled back, and he stopped for a moment, his gaze following the line where night gave way to morning, and in that quiet transition, something inside him settled, not fully understood, but accepted. He reached up, adjusting the brim of his hat against the growing light, and for a brief second his eyes drifted toward the direction where he had last seen her, though he knew the distance had already erased any trace of her presence. Still, he looked, not expecting to see anything, but acknowledging that the space she had moved through remained part of the path he now walked. The wind carried no answer, only the steady movement of the day beginning, and he nodded slightly, more to himself than to anything else, before turning forward again. Ayana continued across the open land, the first warmth of the sun touching her shoulders, the light catching the stone at her neck and reflecting it outward in small, quiet flashes, and she did not notice it, not directly, but she felt it, the way the world around her responded differently now, the way each step seemed to belong entirely to her. The cluster of trees ahead grew clearer with every moment, their leaves catching the early light, and as she approached, she could hear it, the faint sound of water moving through stone, steady and calm. She slowed slightly, not from caution, but from awareness, because reaching a place was not the same as leaving one, and she understood now that every step carried its own meaning, its own weight. Behind her, far beyond sight, the town had already returned to its habits, its routines, its quiet agreements. But something of that day lingered there, not in the words people spoke, but in the ones they did not, in the pauses between their actions, in the small moments where something different might have been possible. And out here, between rising light and open land, both of them moved forward without looking back again, not because the past had lost its hold, but because it had already given them what it could, and what remained ahead no longer needed to be explained, only lived. The water reached her before the trees did, its sound steady and low, weaving through the morning air like something that had always been there waiting. And Ayana slowed as she stepped into the shade, the sunlight breaking into soft fragments through the leaves above, touching the ground in quiet patterns that shifted with the breeze. The place felt different from the open land, not closed, not hidden, but held, like a space that did not ask questions, only offered stillness. She moved closer to the stream, her steps lighter now, not cautious, just aware, and when she reached the edge, she knelt once more, letting her reflection settle in the moving surface, not perfectly clear, but enough to recognize the person looking back. For a moment, she studied it, not searching for who she had been, but noticing who remained, the steadiness in her gaze, the absence of something that had once been there, something that no longer needed to be carried. The necklace rested against her skin, catching the filtered light, and she touched it again, not out of habit, but as acknowledgement, as if confirming that it was still there, that it had not disappeared with the night. The water moved gently past her fingers as she dipped them in again, cool and clean, and she let it run across her skin before lifting her hand, watching the droplets fall back into the stream without leaving a trace. Nothing held them, nothing claimed them, and yet they had been part of something larger for a moment. She rose slowly, her eyes moving through the trees, taking in the shape of the land, the quiet rhythm of it. And for the first time, the idea of staying, even for a while, did not feel like stopping. It felt like choosing. Far across the hills, Caleb Thorne rode along a narrow path that curved between low ridges, his horse moving at an easy pace, guided more by familiarity than urgency. And though the morning had brought clarity, it had not brought answers, only a quieter version of the same question that had followed him since the night before. He did not resist. It did not try to push it aside. He let it move with him, the same way the land did, rising and falling without explanation. The sun climbed higher, warming the air, drawing the scent of earth and grass into something sharper, more present, and he breathed it in without thinking, letting it settle into his chest the way it always had, grounding him in the simplicity of movement. He passed a small outcropping of rock where the path narrowed, his horse stepping carefully, the sound of hooves against stone carrying farther than it should have in the quiet morning. And he paused there briefly, not because he had to, but because something in the stillness caught his attention. Below, in the distance, the line of trees near the water stood out against the open land, their shape distinct, their presence marking something different from the miles of empty ground around them. He did not know why he noticed it, not at first, but his gaze lingered there longer than it should have, and something in him recognized the place before his mind could name it. Ayanna moved deeper into the shade, the ground softer beneath her feet, the air cooler, and she found a place where the trees opened slightly, allowing the light to fall in a wider patch, warming the earth just enough to feel the difference. She stood there for a moment, letting the warmth reach her, letting the quiet surround her, and then she knelt again, this time not at the water's edge, but in the open space, her hands resting lightly against the ground, feeling its steadiness beneath her. She closed her eyes, not in rest, but in awareness, letting the sounds of the place settle around her, the water, the wind, the distant call of something unseen, all of it forming a rhythm that did not demand anything from her. Caleb shifted in the saddle, his eyes still on the distant trees, and though he had no reason to change his course, no clear thought guiding him, he felt the subtle pull of it, not strong, not urgent, just enough to be noticed. He did not turn immediately, did not act on impulse. Instead, he let the moment pass, let the thought settle, and then, without fully deciding, he guided his horse slightly off the path. Not toward the trees, not yet, but not away from them either. Ayanna opened her eyes again, the light different now, brighter, clearer, and she stood, her gaze moving through the space as if seeing it for the first time, not as a place to pass through, but as a place that could hold her, even if only for a moment. She reached up, adjusting the necklace where it rested against her chest, and for the first time since she had placed it there, she let her hand fall away without checking it again, without needing to confirm its presence. It was no longer something she feared losing. It had become something she carried without thought. The water continued its steady movement. The trees held their quiet shade, and the land stretched beyond in every direction, unchanged and yet somehow different. And though neither of them could see the other, though the distance between them remained wide and unbroken, something had shifted once more, subtle and unseen, like a path beginning to curve. Before it reached the point where it would be noticed, and whatever came next would not be shaped by what had been taken or given, but by what they chose to do with the space that had been left open. The morning had fully settled by the time the decision revealed itself, not as a sudden turn, not as a sharp realization, but as a quiet alignment between what was seen and what was felt. And Ayanna stood beneath the open break in the trees, her gaze steady on the space around her, understanding without needing to name it that this place was no longer just a pause along her path. The water moved beside her with the same calm rhythm, untouched by hesitation, and she followed its edge slowly, not searching for anything specific, but letting the land show itself in its own time, the way it always had for those who knew how to listen. Her steps were softer now, not because she feared the ground, but because she no longer needed to press against it, and each movement carried a sense of belonging that had not been there before. The necklace rested where it should, no longer something she reached for, but something that had become part of her presence, like breath, like balance, across the hills. Caleb Thorne guided his horse along the slope that curved closer to the distant trees, not in a straight line, not with intent that could be easily explained, but with the kind of quiet adjustment that comes when a man listens to something beneath thought. The path beneath him shifted from firm dirt to patches of grass and scattered stone, and his horse slowed slightly, sensing the change, stepping with care as the land softened toward the valley below. Caleb did not urge it forward, did not pull it back. He let it choose its footing, the same way he allowed his own direction to settle without force. The trees grew clearer now, their shape no longer distant, their shade visible even from where he rode, and the faint sound of water reached him, carried upward by the wind in broken pieces, just enough to confirm what he already felt. Ayanna paused again near a bend in the stream where the water widened slightly, forming a quiet pool that reflected the sky in soft, shifting colors. And she stood there, not moving, letting the reflection settle until it held her image steady enough to see clearly. There was no trace of the woman who had stood in the dust of that town, no shadow of the rope, no echo of the voices that had tried to define her, only the outline of someone who had stepped beyond all of it and found something else waiting. She knelt once more, placing her hand against the surface of the water, watching as her reflection broke apart and reformed around her fingers, and in that simple motion, she understood something that did not need words, that what had been done to her could not follow her here unless she chose to carry it. Caleb reached the edge of the rise and stopped, his horse shifting beneath him as the land opened into the valley below. And for a moment, he simply looked, taking in the quiet stretch of trees, the movement of water, the way the light settled differently in that space. It was not remarkable, not in the way most men would describe it, but there was something about it that held his attention, something that felt grounded, unchanged by the things that moved through it. He did not move closer right away. He remained where he was, allowing the distance to remain, allowing the place to exist without his presence altering it. Ayanna rose from the water's edge, the droplets falling from her hand disappearing into the ground without a trace, and she turned slowly, her gaze moving through the trees, across the open patches of light, and then beyond, toward the rise where the land lifted again. She did not expect to see anything there, not truly, and yet when her eyes reached that point, something in her stillness shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Caleb sat quietly on his horse, his posture relaxed but attentive, and though he could not see her clearly through the distance and the light, he sensed it, the presence of someone within that space, not as a figure, but as a change in the rhythm of the land itself. Neither of them moved at first, the distance holding steady, the moment stretching without demand, and in that stillness, something settled between what was known and what was felt. Ayanna did not step forward, did not retreat. She simply stood, allowing the awareness to exist without shaping it into action, because she understood now that not every crossing required movement, not every recognition required response. Caleb remained where he was, his gaze steady, his breath even, and for the first time since he had turned from the path the day before, he did not feel the need to continue, not yet, because the direction he had taken had already brought him to something that did not need to be chased. The wind moved softly through the valley, carrying the scent of water and earth upward, brushing against both of them in the same quiet way, connecting two separate places without closing the space between them. And though no words were spoken, though no steps were taken to shorten the distance, the moment held its own meaning, clear and complete, that sometimes the path forward is not about reaching someone, but about arriving at a place where you no longer need to. The distance between them did not close, but it changed, not in miles, not in steps, but in something quieter, something that settled into the space like the morning light that now filled the valley, steady and without urgency. Ayanna remained where she stood for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the ridge where his figure held still against the sky. And though she could not see his face, she did not need to, because the stillness itself spoke in a way words never could. She drew a slow breath, feeling the air move through her chest, grounding her in the present, in the place she had chosen, and in that breath, something shifted, not a question, not a doubt, but a recognition that this moment was not asking her to move closer, or to turn away. It was asking her to understand. The water behind her continued its steady path, the sound soft but constant, a reminder that movement did not always require direction, that some things simply flowed because they were meant to. Caleb Thorne sat quietly on his horse, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, and though he had followed a path that brought him here, he knew now that it was not meant to go further, not in the way most men would expect, not by closing the distance, not by turning a moment into something it was not. His hand rested lightly on the saddle horn, not gripping, not holding on, just there, as if acknowledging the balance he had found without realizing he had been searching for it. The wind moved again, brushing through the valley, lifting the edges of Ayana's hair, carrying the scent of water and earth upward, touching Caleb where he sat, connecting them in a way that did not require sight or sound. Ayana's hand rose slowly to the necklace, her fingers resting against the stone, not to check it, not to hold on to it, but to feel its presence in the moment, to understand that what had been returned to her was not just an object, but a part of herself that no one else could define. She lowered her hand again, her posture straight, her gaze steady, and then, without hesitation, she turned away from the ridge, not in dismissal, not in avoidance, but in acceptance, because she understood now that whatever had passed between them had already given her what she needed. Caleb watched her turn, the movement small but clear even at the distance, and he did not feel loss, did not feel the pull to follow, only a quiet acknowledgement that her path was hers alone, just as his was his. He shifted slightly in the saddle, his horse responding with a small step, and for a moment he remained there, looking at the place where she had stood, even as she moved beyond it. The valley held its silence, the kind that does not demand attention, but offers space, and in that space, both of them found something that did not need to be spoken. Ayana walked deeper into the trees, the light filtering through the leaves in soft patterns across her path, and with each step, the presence behind her faded, not because it was forgotten, but because it had settled into something that did not need to follow her. The ground beneath her feet felt steady, the air around her clear, and for the first time since she had left the town, there was no trace of what had been forced upon her, no shadow of what had been taken, only the quiet certainty of what remained. Caleb turned his horse slowly, guiding it away from the ridge, not with reluctance, not with urgency, but with the same calm decision that had brought him there in the first place. And as he began to move, the land opened before him once more, wide and unclaimed, offering no answers, only the space to continue. The sun climbed higher, the light growing stronger, filling the valley with warmth, and the place where they had stood became just another part of the land, unchanged to any who might pass through, yet marked in a way that could not be seen. Ayana reached a point where the trees thickened, their shade deeper, their presence more complete, and she paused there briefly, not to look back, but to feel the moment settle fully, to let it become part of her without holding on to it. She did not need to return, did not need to confirm anything, because the truth of it was already clear, already complete. Caleb continued along his path, the rhythm of his horse steady beneath him, the sound of its movement blending with the quiet of the land, and though he did not look back, he carried the same understanding, that what had happened did not require explanation, did not require continuation, it simply was, and as the distance between them stretched once more, not empty, not lost, but full of something quiet and enduring, the land held them both in its vast silence, not as strangers, not as something bound together, but as two paths that had crossed just long enough to change direction, and then moved on, each carrying forward something they did not yet fully understand, but would never again be without. By midday, the valley no longer felt like a place she had arrived at. It felt like a place that had begun to accept her, not with welcome, not with promise, but with the quiet absence of resistance, and Ayana moved through it with a steadiness that came not from certainty, but from the simple understanding that she no longer needed permission to exist within it. The trees cast shorter shadows now, the sun rising high enough to press warmth evenly across the ground, and the sound of the stream had shifted from a distant guide to a constant presence, something that did not call her forward but remained beside her, like a companion that asked nothing and offered everything. She paused near a fallen log where the earth softened, the grass bending under her steps, and for the first time since leaving the town, she allowed herself to sit, not out of exhaustion, but out of choice, her posture relaxed. Her gaze drifting across the open spaces between the trees, the necklace rested against her chest, unmoving now, as if it had settled into its place not just on her body, but within her, and she did not reach for it, did not adjust it, because it no longer required attention, it simply belonged. Her eyes traced the line of the water, following its quiet path as it curved through the valley, and she realized then that she was not thinking about where it led, not wondering what lay beyond the next rise. And that absence of urgency felt unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. Far from the valley, Caleb Thorne rode along a stretch of land that opened wide under the midday sun, the hills flattening into long, gentle slopes. And though the path ahead was clear, his pace remained unhurried, his thoughts moving in the same quiet rhythm as the land beneath him. He passed through a narrow pass where the wind funneled between the rocks, carrying with it the faint echo of distant water, and though it was barely there, barely noticeable, it was enough to draw his attention, enough to remind him of the valley he had left behind. He did not turn, did not slow, but the sound stayed with him for a moment longer than it should have, settling into his awareness before fading into the steady quiet of the open land. Ayanna leaned forward slightly, her hands resting against the ground, feeling the texture of the earth beneath her palms, the way it held firm, without resistance, and she closed her eyes briefly, not to rest, but to listen, to the water, to the wind, to the quiet presence of the place itself. When she opened them again, the light had shifted slightly, the shadows moving just enough to remind her that time was passing, that the moment she sat within was not fixed, but moving forward, just as she was. She rose slowly, brushing the dust from her hands, not out of necessity, but out of habit, and as she stood, her gaze lifted once more to the edges of the valley, to the places where the land began to rise again, where paths could form if she chose them. She did not decide immediately, did not set a direction with urgency. Instead, she stood in the center of the space she had claimed, allowing the choice to come to her in its own time. Caleb reached a point where the land opened into a wide stretch of grassland, the horizon stretching unbroken for miles, and he slowed his horse to a stop, not because he had reached a destination, but because something in the openness asked him to pause, to take in the space before moving through it. He looked out across the distance, the sunlight pressing against the ground, the air clear and steady, and for a moment he felt the same stillness he had felt in the valley, the same quiet recognition that not every step needed to be taken immediately. He rested his hand lightly against his horse's neck, feeling the steady breath of the animal, grounding himself in the present, and he let the silence settle around him without filling it with thought. Ayanna took a step forward, then another, her movement slow at first, then steady, her path forming not from a road or a trail, but from her own decision to move, and as she walked, the valley shifted behind her, not disappearing, but becoming part of the distance she had already crossed. The trees thinned slightly, the light growing stronger, and she felt it on her shoulders, warm and steady, a reminder that the day was still unfolding, that there was more ahead than what had already passed. Caleb urged his horse forward again, not with urgency, but with quiet intention, his direction clear not because he had chosen it in a moment, but because he had allowed it to form over time, the same way the land shaped itself under wind and weather. And though the miles between them stretched wider with every step, though their paths no longer crossed in sight or sound, something remained, not as a tie, not as a bond, but as a quiet understanding carried forward in the way they moved, in the way they chose, in the way they allowed the world to be what it was without forcing it into something else, and in that shared silence, spread across distance and time, the meaning of what had happened settled fully into place, not as something that needed to be remembered, but as something that had already become part of who they were, shaping the ground beneath their feet even as they walked away from it. By the time the sun began its slow descent, the land had settled into that quiet hour where everything seemed to pause without stopping, and Ayanna walked beneath that fading light with a steadiness that no longer needed to be tested, because it had already proven itself in every step she had taken since she left the town behind. The valley now lay far behind her, not as a place she had abandoned, but as a place that had given her something she would carry without effort, something that longer needed to be held tightly, and as she moved across the open land once more, the horizon stretched wide and clear, offering no directions, no signs, only space. The necklace rested against her chest, unmoving in the still air, and she did not think of it now, not consciously, because it had become part of the quiet rhythm of her existence, like breath, like the sound of her own footsteps against the ground. She slowed near a rise where the land lifted gently, the grasses catching the last light in soft waves of gold, and she stepped onto it without hesitation, her gaze lifting to meet the horizon where the sky deepened into shades of amber and blue. She stopped there, not out of uncertainty, but because the moment itself asked for stillness, the kind that comes when something has reached its natural end without needing to be declared. Behind her, miles away and unseen, Caleb Thorne rode along a long stretch of open plain, the light of the setting sun casting his shadow far ahead of him, stretching it into something that moved before he did, and he followed it without thought, without resistance, the rhythm of his horse steady beneath him. He had not turned back, had not questioned the path he had chosen, and yet something of that day remained with him, not as a memory he replayed, but as a quiet presence that shaped the way he moved through the world now, the way he looked at things that once seemed simple. The land around him carried the same stillness, the same sense of something settled, and he let it surround him without trying to understand it, because understanding was no longer necessary. Ayanna stood on the rise, the wind brushing lightly against her, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant earth, and she closed her eyes for a moment, not to reflect, not to remember, but simply to feel the completeness of where she stood, the absence of anything that needed to be resolved. When she opened them again, the horizon remained unchanged, vast and open, and she knew without needing to question it that this was where her path continued, not defined by what had happened, not shaped by what had been taken, but by the choices she would make from here forward. She took a step, then another, moving down the other side of the rise, her figure blending into the land as the light softened around her, and with each step, the distance between who she had been and who she had become stretched further, not in a way that erased the past, but in a way that placed it exactly where it belonged, behind her, no longer holding her in place. Caleb slowed his horse as the light dimmed, the day giving way to evening, and he came to a stop near a stretch of open ground where the horizon met the sky without interruption, and for a moment he simply sat there, looking out at the distance, not searching for anything, not expecting anything, just acknowledging the space in front of him. His hand rested lightly against the saddle, his posture relaxed, and he drew a slow breath, the air cooler now, carrying the quiet of the coming night. He did not think of her as someone he had lost, did not think of the moment as something unfinished, because there was nothing missing from it, nothing left undone. It had been exactly what it needed to be, no more, no less. The wind moved again, softer now, and he adjusted the brim of his hat slightly, a small, familiar gesture, before guiding his horse forward once more, his path continuing without hesitation. Ayanna moved steadily across the land, the light fading behind her, the first hints of evening settling in, and though the world around her remained vast and open, it no longer felt uncertain. It felt filled with possibility, not in a way that promised anything, but in a way that allowed everything. She did not look back, not once, because there was nothing behind her that called her, nothing that required her return, and the forward path held all that she needed. The distance between them stretched into something immeasurable, not empty, not lost, but complete, carrying the quiet truth of what had passed without needing to be spoken. And as the last light of the day slipped below the horizon, leaving the land in the calm of evening, the story did not end with a reunion, did not close with a promise. It settled instead into something quieter, something deeper, that out here, in a place where men often believed everything could be owned, there are moments that cannot be claimed, only witnessed, and once witnessed, they do not bind people together. They set them free to walk their own path with a dignity that no one can take away.